Continuing on with Chapter 13, we're going to continue to look at this rise of mass democracy during the Jacksonian era. Now, the Trail of Tears was obviously one example of this forced migration, not just with the Cherokee, but other tribes as well. Some of the other Native American resistance that we see, specifically 1832, the Black Hawk War, where the Black Hawk tribes were told to exchange their land from the eastern side of the Mississippi River to the western portion of the Mississippi River, namely out in the Oklahoma Territory. The Black Hawk resisted and were crushed in 1832. Also, the Second Seminole War, the Seminoles down in Florida, once again, were denying this idea of giving up their native lands and being pushed westward. So between 1835 and 1842, the U.S. government went to war against the Seminole Indians down south until finally 4/5 of them were pushed out to Oklahoma when they were destroyed during the Second Seminole War. And to this date, this is the most expensive, longest-lasting war all the way up until the Vietnam War. And the leader of the Second Seminole War was Ocala, who we know is a county down in Florida today. Here you see a map depicting some of these forced migrations out to Indian Territory, or what we call today Oklahoma. Now, another part of Jackson's platform, another part of Jackson's personality, was like other Westerners or other of the common man, Jackson hated the Bank of the United States. Yes, that Bank of the United States that Alexander Hamilton had created way back in the day. Here's why. Like other Westerners, they felt that the Bank of the United States was too monopolistic. It was not necessarily a U.S. institution. Remember, this is a private bank. So the Bank of the United States is not loyal to the people of the United States, but to those people investing in the Bank of the United States. He felt that the Bank of the U.S. had too much power over the common people, and that it was only favoring those wealthy industrialists in the East and hurting those Southern and Westerners out West, namely because this is where we see a lot of the farm foreclosures occurring, and the Bank of the United States was the owner of a lot of those loans. So Andrew Jackson decided to make it his personal mission in life to destroy the Bank of the United States. Now, the president of the Bank of the United States was Nicholas Biddle, who we will see later in a second Andrew Jackson going to war with. But anyway, 1832, Andrew Jackson is up for re-election. Henry Clay, who we know hates Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay's buddy, Daniel Webster, who also hates Andrew Jackson, decided to make the Bank of the United States an issue for the 1832 election. Now, the Bank of the United States was not set to expire until 1836, but they wanted this to be an issue in 1832 because they were hoping to trap Jackson between a rock and a hard place and make the American people hate him and thus not vote for him. It was a campaign ploy. So they put the renewal of the Bank of the United States before Congress. Congress passed it. The renewal bill was put on Jackson's desk as president to sign or to veto. Jackson decided to veto this Bank of the United States extension bill. He said basically that the Bank of the United States was bad for the U.S. and it was unconstitutional according to Jackson. Now, this bank veto, as we know, this is not correct at all. The president does not have the right to declare an act of Congress to be unconstitutional. McCulloch versus Maryland already took care of that when the Supreme Court ruled that the Bank of the United States is a constitutional entity. He had no right to declare this. So Henry Clay was sitting there laughing his evil laugh because he felt that he had Jackson right where he wanted him. They printed off thousands upon thousands of Jackson's bank veto message and distributed it to the people all over the United States as a way to point out, see, Jackson doesn't know what he's doing. He's trying to expand the president's power, the executive power. He's taking on too much of the powers that do not belong to him. But this plan backfired because many of the people in the United States actually sided with Jackson. So whether or not he was expanding the executive privilege didn't matter because other people in the United States also hated the Bank of the United States. And to them, this was a reason to vote for Jackson, not to vote against him like Clay had originally intended. So even though the renewal bill had been vetoed by Jackson, that didn't matter because the original bank charter didn't actually expire until 1836. So here's Jackson. He has vetoed the Bank of the United States, but it is still around till minimally 1836. He made it his mission in his second term to choke the Bank of the United States to death. He wanted to make sure that it was not able to come back, that no secret deals or side deals could be made to ensure that it continued on. So Andrew Jackson required his Secretary of the Treasury to remove all federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. He had to go through 3 different guys before he finally found somebody willing to do this, because the Secretary of the Treasury realized what this was going to do. By the United States pulling all of its money out of the Bank of the United States, that is reducing the amount of money that is able to be circulated through the economy, and this could potentially create a problem. To add insult to injury, Nicholas Biddle, who was the bank president at this time, really wanted to show the American people, and Jackson for that matter, how important the Bank of the United States was. So Biddle responded by calling in loans. So what this would mean is if you were a businessman at this time and you had taken a loan out from the Bank of the United States, you would pay a mortgage or you would pay on your loan for X number of years till you'd paid it off. But all of a sudden here comes Nicholas Biddle knocking on your door demanding full payment right here and now. Well, obviously people didn't have that money to pay back their loan right then and there, and so homes and farms and businesses were being foreclosed upon left and right. This was creating a mini panic or a mini economic crisis. Finally, the U.S. federal government started putting its money, its federal deposits, in what were known as pet banks and wildcat banks. Pet banks is kind of a derogatory term to overnight banks that grew up out of nowhere that were loyal to the Democratic Party. They were pets to the Democratic Party. And wildcat banks, similar idea. These are overnight banks that were growing up out west. Now, the problem is that each bank, when a bank is created and there is no system or organization for controlling these little banks, they would then get federal deposits or they would get deposits put into their amount and they would print paper money, their own personal paper money to distribute. Well, the more banks that are out there, the more paper is being circulated as opposed to federal coinage or what is known as specie. Specie is federal coinage. So these paper bank currencies were flooding the market and adding to the economic downturn. Finally, in 1836, the Secretary of State issued a directive known as Specie Circular, requiring all federal land purchases to be bought in federal coin or in hard gold coinage as a way to end speculation, because the federal government was sick and tired of selling off its western land using this cheap inflated currency that is coming out of these pet and wildcat banks. This added to the panic of 1837, but by this point Andrew Jackson was already long gone from office. So here you see them luring people in, these pet and wildcat banks, to come on in. Now, so grows the new political party that's going to be around up to the Civil War. The Whig Party. This is literally the I Hate Jackson political party, and they named themselves the Whigs based on that old revolutionary group, the Whigs, who were against the king at the time, King George III. From the Whigs' perspective, Andrew Jackson has essentially named himself a king. Too much executive power. He has taken too much of Congress's power, and they nicknamed him King Andrew I because he was expanding the power of the presidency. So, some leading members of this new Whig Party are obviously Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. They are the big 3. Now, we're sick and tired of Andrew Jackson and his usurpation or taking over their power. And the Congress at this time actually censured Jackson, which is a slap on the wrist, for removing the federal money for the bank because they felt that it was going to do damage to the American economy. Now, the Whigs, even though Jackson said that he was for the common man, the Whigs said, we are actually for the common man. And the Whigs are really a hodgepodge group of people from all walks of life, but what they have in common is they are against Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. So, the Whigs claim themselves to be the party of the common man, whereas they also claim that the Democrats are for cronyism and corruption. Here you see, obviously, this is from the Whig perspective of King Andrew the First, quote unquote, that he has taken over too much power. And you'll notice on this slide some of the common things that the Democrats versus the Whigs were in favor of. The Democrats were in favor of laissez-faire, or keeping their hands off the economy. They were in favor of lower taxes. They wanted to abolish the national bank, and they called themselves the party of the common man. The Whigs, we hate Jackson. They wanted more government involvement in the economy, namely with the American system. This is going to be a reform-minded party because they felt that the government could bring about good social change. So let's take a look at that panic of 1837. Other causes for this economic downturn in 1837. The fact that land speculation has been going on, and this is a common theme. Remember, speculation means whatever the commodity is, I'm going to try to buy low and sell high. So I want to buy land at a very, very cheap price and then sell it off later for a huge profit. Sure, that works out fine for a couple of people, but the economy can't sustain that. Not everyone can make millions of dollars by buying low and selling high. And the end result is if you put everything you have into this and the economy collapses, you lose everything. Add to that bank war that was going on between Jackson and Biddle, and the death of the Bank of the United States, which is dead and gone from now on. All that money that was being pumped into the Wildcat and pet banks. If those banks closed, all the money went down the tube with it. Specie Circular, requiring Americans to buy federal land with gold coinage. It just wasn't in circulation as much in order to allow people to buy it. And to add insult to injury, there was a period of crop failures where even American farmers were not doing that well. Add to that there was an economic crisis overseas, namely in Great Britain. Great Britain started calling in some of their loans from the United States, which only exacerbated this panic. And so what happened, like we're going to see time and time again with an economic collapse? Hundreds of banks across the United States closed their doors. And there was no federal insurance at this time backing up your money. So if you had all your money in one of those banks that closed, your money is just gone. It's just absolutely gone. Factories closed. People were unemployed. Less public land was being sold, etc., etc., etc. The economy was slowly deteriorating. It was stagnating. If you think of the economy like a flowing river, you need to have jobs available. You need to have businesses open in order to keep money circulating and keep people buying stuff, etc. But as factories closed, people lost their jobs. They couldn't buy stuff. Other factories closed. It is a domino effect across the board. The economy was stagnating, and banks were collapsing as a result. The Whigs had one interpretation. They wanted to have more bank credit available. They wanted that easy credit to make money available to people to jumpstart the economy. They wanted to create subsidies for internal improvements, namely that American system that we've already talked about. On the other hand was the divorce bill, or the independent treasury bill that was promoted by Martin Van Buren, who was president at this time. He wanted to create an independent treasury and lock up all federal money into vaults. Well, sure, that keeps federal money safe for the time being, but that money then wouldn't go into circulation and wouldn't help to repair the economy. Now, completely different issue is the issue over in Mexico. Mexico at this time owns Texas. Westward expansion, many Americans wanted to move into Texas. Texas really wasn't inhabited by Mexicans at this time, even though they owned this territory. So the new government of Mexico, which had recently won its independence from Spain, offered a deal to an American, Stephen Austin, to give him a land grant in the state of, or in the territory of Texas, to populate it with 500 American Catholic families, who also promised to assimilate to Mexican culture. They would give up being Americans and they would assimilate to Mexican culture. The problem is, number one, these Americans refused to assimilate, and number two, a lot of them were not actually Catholic as well. Austin actually brought in some pretty shady characters, some adventurers, etc. People like Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, Sam Houston, etc. Also, these Texans now brought with them their slaves from the South. Mexico had made slavery illegal. So the government of Mexico said, you can't have slaves. Slavery is illegal here. But these Texans viewed this as their right, that this is their property, and so they refused to abide by the Mexican government's laws. So the dictator of Mexico at this time, Santa Anna, raised an army and threw Stephen Austin in jail for having violated that original agreement that they had had. And very promptly, the Texans, who were obviously former Americans, rose up and declared themselves an independent country, the Lone Star Republic of Texas, and named Sam Houston as their commander-in-chief. Now, the United States at this time decided to take a neutral perspective on this because they didn't want to make Mexico angry. However, many Americans sided with the Texans in this and started sending in supplies and whatnot to Texas to help them, especially after they heard what had happened at the Alamo. The Alamo was a former missionary that the Texans had basically been boarded up, and they'd been surrounded by Santa Anna's troops, and all but one of them was killed in the last stand at the Alamo. So when word got out what had happened, and all these former Americans were now killed by the Mexican government, the Remember the Alamo became a rallying cry, and American aid, specifically from Southerners in America, began pouring in. Sam Houston, as the commander-in-chief of the Texan Army, lured Santa Anna away, counterattacked, and captured him. While in captivity, he forced 2 treaties out of Santa Anna, basically declaring the Texas government an independent country and that the Rio Grande was their boundary. However, Santa Anna said later on that he was under duress and refused to acknowledge these treaties because it had been done while he was in captivity. So the U.S., the official line of the United States was neutrality. But the day before Jackson left office, he recognized the Lone Star Republic as an independent country. Now, recognition from a major country like the United States is a huge win for Texas, but a huge slap in the face to Mexico. And very, very quickly, many of the Texans started asking to be annexed by the United States. They wanted to apply to be a state to the United States. However, the issue of slavery held up this statehood annexation for the time being because Northerners did not want to upset the balance of power between slave and free states because Texas obviously wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. We'll get back to that later. Now, the 1840 election. Martin Van Buren, running again, versus the Whig candidate William Henry Harrison with John Tyler as his VP candidate. We remember William Henry Harrison from the Battle of Tippecanoe from the War of 1812. Really, we don't know anything about William Henry Harrison's stand on stuff because this was not an election in which they talked about issues. It was more about perception. So one of the Democratic newspapers of the day said that William Henry Harrison should just be happy with go and live in his log cabin and drink his hard cider. It was meant to be an insult towards William Henry Harrison. However, the Whigs adopted this as their symbol because they said, guess what? The common man lives in a log cabin and he drinks hard cider. And maybe Martin Van Buren might be a wealthy aristocrat who does nothing but drink champagne all day, but we're happy with our log cabins and hard cider. Also advocating Tippecanoe and Tyler too. So this election, like I said, was not about issues. It was about personality, about perception. The reality was William Henry Harrison did not live in a log cabin, and he probably didn't drink hard cider. He was a wealthy man who lived in a mansion, but it was all about perception. And the perception was that Harrison is a common man. And so he won this election very easily, 234 electoral votes to 60, and not a single issue was debated. Here you see this William Henry Harrison and John Tyler by their log cabin drinking some hard cider, and that's the common man. And that is chapter 13.